All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's part of our learning series webinars. Where we take a deeper dive into some of these technical topics. And today's topic is commercial lighting, market movements, and opportunities. And so before we get started, let me go over a couple housekeeping items here. It is best to listen through your computer audio. But if that's not working, there is the phone call option to dial in. And we will have time at the end of today's presentation for question and answers. So as we go along, if something comes to you to ask a question, type it into the question box and we'll get that answered at the end. If you're viewing on Chrome, that box will look a little different, but you'll find it. And that's how we will know to answer your questions. And today's presentation is being recorded, and we'll typically have that recording in about 2 to 3 weeks. And yeah, so now let me introduce you to today's speaker, Kyle Hemmi. He's our senior engineer and lighting subject matter expert here at CLEAResult. He has more than 25 years of experience in the energy engineering, lighting design, product sales, and management. For the past 18 years, he's consulted electric utility, commercial, government, and allied industry clients throughout the U.S. His expertise lies in engineering support and management and verification of energy efficiency projects and programs with advanced lighting and lighting controls. What's more, he serves on the technical steering committee for the Design Lights Consortium, SSL, and networked lighting controls initiatives. And lastly, he's held several leadership roles in committee positions within the Illuminating Engineering Society. And with that, Kyle, I'm gonna hand it over to you to go over today's agenda.
Thanks, and welcome all. I'm joining you from sunny Silver City, New Mexico today. And going over the agenda real quickly, I'll first start out with a quick DEI moment, leveraging a presentation I saw at Light Fair this year on light justice. Then we'll talk a little bit about the present, what's going on in the lighting market, what's happening with some special kind of regulatory activities like EISA, like IRA and infrastructure bill funding, like some state fluorescent ban activity that's been going on lately. And with that present situation in mind, the real focus of the presentation will be future looking or future facing. So most of it will focus on what are the pathways forward given our current situation, given where the lighting market saturation levels are at. So with that, let's move into our first subject. So again, I was blessed to have been able to attend a presentation on light justice at this year's Light Fair. And just to give a quick kind of overview or definition of light justice, light justice really means a lighting application, a design that really contributes to the overall health, something that's healthy, something that's very inviting, something that's welcoming, something that's also kind of universal and inclusive of different populations and different people. And it's also kind of structurally equitable and intentional in its purpose and its focus. So what does it look like when we have light injustice? So some of these pictures were taken of the NYPD's recent kind of omnipresence effort, which was enacted shortly after their unpopular kind of frisk policies that were in place. But as you can see, this really kind of takes away from and encroaches on kind of the environment of folks in their natural setting, in their place of home, their place of, just public sites. And generally, if you go into different or more underserved neighborhoods, you just really don't see the level of attention and detail to lighting and lighting design that you would see elsewhere. And this type of design or even kind of unintentional effects can be overall just generally harmful. It can be kind of scary or intimidating. And we can see these nicer applications being very privileged or exclusive. So better lighting design is often unattainable for a lot of underserved communities. And it's also kind of a structural thing. When we think about lighting injustice, it's a systemic thing. Inequity or equity is a systemic in nature. So we have to really think about the design system, design community, not just from lighting, but also just interior design and how we go about building, etc. And we should think about it in our programs as well. It deserves some reflection. You know, some additional examples to the ones that I provided here, if you think about like back of house lighting and applications as opposed to what you might see in the front of the house in, say, a nice restaurant or a hotel, as opposed to what's back behind closed doors. Prisons are another example where lighting is often harsh and kind of detrimental to kind of their overall health by keeping lights on, in some cases 24 hours. So just wanted to provide you a little bit of an example of that, something to think about. You know, I've been in the lighting industry a long time, and I can't say that I've sat back and reflected on this as much as I have since I saw this presentation. So with that, let's kind of move on into the lighting market updates. So everybody's relatively familiar with kind of EISA and how that went down. So we recently, at the beginning of July, reached kind of the full penalty period, so that if these products are kind of sold or distributed in individual markets, the penalties increase for that. So that's really kind of signaled the beginning of the end, or in many cases, for most programs, the end of kind of screw-based lighting in programs. I know Energy Star and the DOE are exploring maybe looking at a higher than 45 lumens per watt standard, especially in kind of the downlight space, but I could see that also taking hold maybe with screw-based lighting in the future, as we may look towards LED to LED retrofits and lighting gets more and more efficient. We might be able to leverage that. One other area of regulatory activity of particular interest is recent activity more at the state level. We also saw it in Europe and Canada, you know, kind of at the national or continental level, with states and Europe and Canada moving towards banning fluorescent lighting, mainly on the grounds of mercury content, not so much from the energy efficiency side. So that's the direction they've been taking on that. So you see states like California, Oregon, Colorado, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Maine, and soon, I believe, Massachusetts recently took that up in the legislature. I'm not sure exactly where that landed. But there are other states looking into it as well. And certainly, if the current administration, I think, kind of continues further into the future, I think the federal government will also look at maybe taking a similar approach through the EPA and looking at banning it at the federal level as well. But certainly something to keep an eye on, particularly if this impacts your particular state, because it can have, depending on how your regulator, how your evaluators look at this and how you update TRMs and baselines, et cetera, it can have a significant impact on kind of accelerating or increasing baselines in the not so distant future, sooner than we would have anticipated otherwise. So couple that with your general recessionary signs, supply chain, continued hiccups on that front, increased kind of building vacancy levels and a tight labor market continuing. These broader kind of collective efforts are really impacting kind of what's happening. And we have another slide on that here shortly, so I'll talk about that in more detail then. Code updates, just recently, tomorrow, all states should have looked at or adopted a commercial energy code, at least as strict as ASHRAE 90.1 2019. You know, we've seen states kind of drag their heels on that, on moving on those in the future, but it generally signals a trend towards stricter new construction codes, and that kind of has a trickle-down effect, not just on the new construction space, obviously, but in retrofit markets over time as well. And then a lot of you about a year ago were familiar with the recent DLC delisting of version 5.0 products that pulled roughly 72% of the products, or 450,000 products, off the list. So a lot of programs between then and now, and maybe even some continuing through the rest of this year, grandfathered version 5.0 to make sure that enough product was able to get back on the list. And we're up around 300,000 products now in version 5.1, so it does look like those products are finding their way back onto those listings. So that wasn't as much of a hiccup as it might have been kind of early on in that delisting process. So moving on, I do want to just provide a quick snapshot of the overall supply chain. We're going to talk a lot about these groups on the top, manufacturers, distributors, when we talk more about the market and what's going on and what the trends are, but it's just important to kind of understand this. We'll also talk a little bit about workforce development and the needs in our industry and market, and that really hits those bottom groups, the contractors and ESCOs and the companies that are doing a lot of work. So as programs change, as programs shift, as programs have a greater focus on controls, you know, there really is a greater need for workforce development, and then really keeping an eye on and focusing on some of these supply chain challenges and market trends that are going on. So with that in mind, we've done a lot of recent interviews. We continue to do interviews with manufacturers and distributors, and it's definitely hinting towards kind of continued flat or slowed growth for the remainder of 2023 and probably moving well into 2024. Looking at a couple of publications, the Pulse of Lighting and Electro Industry Business Confidence Index, you can see that large C&I projects in particular are kind of flat or slowed, with small to medium-sized projects making up a lot of the activity right now. So you should be seeing that in your programs, and it should be something that you're looking at going after, because I know in our conversations with manufacturers and distributors, they're taking a harder look and allocating more resources to going after smaller and smaller projects. Distributors are destocking inventory, so inventory levels are dropping as they see kind of a slowdown. That's an indication of an overall slowdown that you can see here on the left. You can see that line trending down kind of quarter over quarter as we move forward. And again, manufacturers slowed sales and slowed pipelines as well. And so looking forward, they definitely expect that to be flat or to worsen over the next 6 months, you know, in surveys of those. And this labor shortage and switchgear delays, and you have delays on kind of spec grade type troughers and other equipment as well, delays on controls equipment as well. And those types of things taken in collectively really, you know, make it difficult to move ahead at the normal pace that we're accustomed to on these types of projects. So just something to definitely keep in mind. There's some light at the end of the tunnel with a lot of the federal spending, some of the other things we'll talk about, but this is definitely has kind of a downward pressure on what we're seeing in terms of lighting sales and lighting projects, with, you know, maybe people keeping really busy, but they're keeping really busy going after smaller and smaller projects. And that takes up more resources and more time just to get, you know, a similar or flat or even a slightly lower level of sales and volume. So looking at kind of what we traditionally get or where we traditionally get our savings, this is overall data from CLEAResult programs that we could pull down for 2021, because that was the most comprehensive set we had available at the time. So it hasn't transitioned or changed much over the last year or so, although we probably are seeing less and less lamps and kind of trim kit activity, with EISA kind of phasing out or certainly slowing the activity we're seeing on that lamps front. And if we take in some of that other regulatory activity that I spoke about a little bit earlier, about 80 to 85% of the remaining pie, when we take out those lamps, is really closely connected with fluorescent lighting and compact fluorescent lighting, both linear and compact fluorescent. And some of that is, at greater and greater risk as we see higher and higher saturation levels naturally, but also in part due to maybe some of this fluorescent band activity that's occurring. And it kind of depends on, again, how your regulator and evaluators look at that. Are they looking at it as more of a business as usual? Let's continue, while there's still that product out in the market and it's still functioning, let's continue with baselines as normal. Others will enact more of a dual baseline approach where year over year you'll start seeing less and less savings per unit because they're attributing less and less of that to decreasing remaining useful life for the equipment that's available in the field where those bands do exist. And then, others may take a more stringent approach. For example, I think Vermont is slated to cease their midstream programs as of next year, at least specifically for kind of like tube-based or linear fluorescent-based product. So again, Vermont was the first state that's going to enact the statewide ban in January 1 of 2024. So that's kind of our canary in the coal mine, something we can monitor, something we can look at as to how they're dealing with it. And then we know, how is California, Oregon, Colorado, and other states, Rhode Island, Maine, et cetera, going to deal with that. But definitely something to keep in mind. Let's take a closer look into the different buckets of available technology that are out there. And I created these 3 scenarios on the left because your existing kind of market saturation levels really depend on, how long the program's been around, how aggressive and how many different, program offerings are available, and, what are the incentive levels that are available. So I've, like an EE-based type model, might have just like simpler prescriptive and maybe a custom offering. Maybe it's been around for 4 or 5, 6-ish years, and the incentives are on kind of the lower end of the spectrum, maybe $20 for a troffer or something in the neighborhood of like 8 to 10 cents per kWh. Whereas a kind of a full EE program, something that's been around for 8, maybe 9, 10 years, might have a full portfolio. So you have your new construction program, you've got a targeted small business program, you've got midstream and prescriptive and custom, and maybe a design focused type program. And then maybe your incentives are a little bit higher, so it might not be $20, it might be $30 to $35 for a troffer, and maybe something more in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 cents or 15 cents per kWh. And then kind of the driver market, again, a whole portfolio plus, maybe they have a lot of R&D activities and super special design assistance with a lot of tiered type offerings, and maybe something very specific or focused on lighting controls. And it's been around for 12, 14, 15 years with much higher incentives levels in, say, I don't know, maybe $60, $75 for a troffer, and maybe a $50, $60, $70 adder to add controls to that troffer. So again, with that in mind, if we look over at the linear bars, EE base is kind of starting out right now just below maybe 50% market saturation, but we expect that over the next couple of years, over 2023 and through 2024, at the end of 2024, maybe eclipsing 60% even in those markets, and then pushing towards in 2026, 2027, towards that 75 and even approaching 80. And it depends how much impact maybe some of this legislation also has. That might move it ahead even further if that legislation is present in one of those particular markets. As we move up, you can see there's a 5 to 6 to 7% bump as we move into maybe one of those other areas that's been targeting for a little longer with more aggressive incentives. And those are, going from, say, 55% now up to maybe the low 80%. And evaluators start looking at market transformation, when we start getting to that 80, 85, 90% level, the market starts to look a little bit more transformed in nature. So again, depending on your regulatory environment, your evaluation market, as we start approaching 80% and above, that's something that can definitely change the way regulators and evaluators kind of look at the remaining potential and things like free ridership, et cetera. And then the EE driver models, again, already at the high 60% levels, moving towards 75, 80% over the next couple years, and then up to around 90% in 2026 and beyond. And some of those same EE driver markets are some of the same that are enacting fluorescent ban legislation now as well. So that's linear. If we look at high bay, very similar numbers, with high bay maybe pushing a little bit ahead of linear fluorescent. That's been a bread and butter measure for a lot of our programs. And while we still see high bay, we're starting to see fewer and fewer HID high bay replacements. So a lot of the remaining high bay potential is actually fluorescent technology, stuff that was done 10 years ago or back in the ARA days. We're now going after and replacing T5HO, maybe some T8 high bay technology, and whatever HO technology remains out there. And that's why I was saying, again, that linear piece of pie not only encompasses all of that linear bucket here, but also a good percentage of the remaining high bay potential. And then exterior, again, that was one of the very early adoption LED markets, higher saturation levels to start with, and that's going to push up and above 90%. With infrastructure bill money being available for a lot of infrastructure projects, and as well as exterior lighting upgrades, I expect that exterior market to be attacked very aggressively. Whatever remaining baseline technologies are out there that are HID are going to be addressed through infrastructure bill and IRA funding over the next few years. So again, thinking about this, in that linear bucket, about 65% of your remaining kWh savings potential, including controls being attached to that linear technology, is going to fall in that linear bucket, with about another 20% in that high bay bucket and another 15%. And again, 65 plus 20, with much of that high bay being replacing fluorescent technology, really focuses in on linear replacement technologies. All right, so with all of that in place, just something to keep in mind, keeping in the backdrop as we move to these kind of pathways forward. So what can we do? I don't think a presentation would be acceptable these days if we didn't at least have one slide on the infrastructure bill and Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. Lots of funding available in both. Infrastructure bill has a lot of training, a lot of infrastructure projects themselves that can definitely find their way into programs. Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of this is residential focused. I mean, there's a lot of work being done on weatherization, et cetera, but there's also tons and tons of grant money and other funds available that would definitely impact the C&I market as well. And one of the common things that flows through all of these, as I look at bids and prizes and other grants that are coming out as a result of this legislation, are these themes on the right. And I think they align pretty well with a lot of the themes and focuses of programs of utilities these days. We hear a lot about workforce development, about focuses on small business and the equity and the government's Justice 40 initiative, which a lot of this funding coming through these bills, this legislation, has Justice 40 kind of requirements or expectations attached to it. So the concept of resiliency and capacity, electrification has a big focus. Carbon and greenhouse gas reductions, which is a big motivator for a lot of this, and health outcomes as a whole. You hear about these, you see these if you tear apart the RFPs and the grant applications, these are the themes. And I think these can easily be aligned with utility programs and certainly next gen and future facing programs like healthy homes initiatives, et cetera. You can also have healthy business initiatives and initiatives that are focused on more than just kind of the energy piece itself. So definitely something to keep in mind. You'll see these themes pop up as I go through. So maximizing your remaining opportunities, again, really focusing on that small business element. Small to medium business is a good practice. That's what the market's focused on. That's what the supply chain is really focused on. Don't ignore the big projects, but you might expect some delays in those projects or with entities kind of putting some of those on hold. And you might see even more of that in kind of the real estate space with property management companies as well, with vacancy rates being as high as they've been in the last 30 years. But again, focusing on these equity eligible businesses in Justice 40, small to medium sized businesses are those businesses that have traditionally been underserved in programs over time. And I recently attended this webinar series. I think we had one on midstream lighting in our energy forum recently, and there was a lot of talk about how that midstream channel is a really good way to address that remaining potential that you saw in those charts that I mentioned before, but it's also a great way to get at some of the smaller to medium-sized businesses in a cost-effective and efficient way that might otherwise kind of slip through the cracks with a traditional kind of prescriptive or custom offering. Then the controls focus. It's definitely time to start thinking about, do we eliminate dumb systems? You know, should we focus entirely on controlled systems or products in our programs? Or at a bare minimum, should we redesign the offering that really draws the attention and puts the foot on the scale for the controlled option? So whereas you might have a $50 incentive for a troffer now and $75 with controls, you know, maybe you have $80 with controls and $40, you know, for the fixture in and of itself. And it really draws the market and the trade allies' attention towards that controlled option, because we really want to extract the full value of the retrofit by getting controls in there, and we want to be able to leverage those controls to extract additional value through analytics and other types of things I'll talk about in a moment. And we really want to take a systems approach to incentives and cost effectiveness. Again, that example that I just gave you of kind of putting your foot on the pedal a little bit more for controls is that kind of systems approach to setting up your incentive structure, but also from a cost effectiveness standpoint, as we savings kind of decrease, or maybe we're not able to take advantage of, you know, incentives or as much of an incentive or savings for the fixture piece of it. If we just look at, you know, controls by themselves, you know, maybe they don't look as cost effective, or they might not pass cost effectiveness. But if we can combine them with the fixture option and evaluate them as a system, as a whole, along with maybe some non-energy benefits and looking at increasing those, then we can maintain cost effectiveness and drive more participation and volume in controls as a whole. And then build towards an LED to LED offering. So LED to LED with controls, obviously, because you want to extract as much value. So going from earlier gen LEDs to new LEDs, there's not as much fixture savings to be had there. So it's important to add as much of that control savings as possible, but it does require work, doing analytics, going back and making assumptions about, you know, what the installed base of LEDs out there are, and really working to ensure that your LED to LED retrofits and measures are cost effective in your area over time. So start working with your evaluators, regulators, and your teams to get those in place over time. So again, talking more about extracting the full value, it's about doing deeper and deeper retrofits, maybe combining those controls with some HVAC integration by taking occupancy data and doing occupancy-based HVAC control, or maybe even occupancy-based automated demand response, not just for the lighting portion of the system, but also the HVAC, because we can really dial the temperature back, or dial ventilation, or running the HVAC system back if we know kind of the occupancy levels or unoccupancy of certain spaces. And leverage that data also, not just occupancy, but also additional information that's coming in through these systems of the light levels, temperature, pressure, humidity, and lots of other things that are being added. And if you can pull that data in and get that information to the right people, involve folks that understand integration, that can couple those systems, you can really leverage the lighting control system to drive additional savings. And then really start looking at those NEIs. In all but those driver markets that I mentioned before, often the incentives by themselves aren't enough to draw the trade allies' attention to and start really driving volume and focus on controls. We just can't throw enough money at it. But if we can slowly gain a better grip on and understanding of NEIs and leverage work like the DOE and the IES Economics Committee are doing right now to value the effects on kind of work performance, well-being, the operational benefits, both maintenance and energy savings, demand savings, and looking at lighting kind of as an asset for things like tracking assets through the system, or ensuring that you're leveraging and utilizing your space to its maximum benefit as well. So really looking into those seriously and working with your evaluators and regulators to build more and more of that NEI benefit, those health benefits, again, those buzzwords, those benefits for equity eligible communities, and really leveraging those and the interest and focus on those to really drive this. Electrification is another thing that brings its own kind of demand based challenges as you may increase electrical load. Doing deep retrofits through lighting and really controlling things and leveraging demand response can help minimize or mitigate the impacts of electrification, and maybe even circumvent having to upgrade panels and other infrastructure in a facility. And again, all of this facilitates kind of expanded program models and revenue streams as we recognize and understand better what the actual value of these additional benefits and this integration really is. We can build new program models specifically around that aren't just one-for-one widget-based replacements. All right. So again, other opportunities that I would encourage folks to focus on or think about. That office vacancy piece is we're at a 30-year high. You know, Dallas, I think, is up around 35%. You know, the Portland market, I think, is approaching 30%. I think overall, countrywide, we're close to 20% vacancy levels for office space. That's huge. So what are people doing? How do we deal with empty or partially occupied buildings that might still be running their heating, ventilation, AC type systems? How do we make those more efficient? And how do we look at maybe repurposing those spaces? A lot of folks, because we have housing shortages in a lot of markets, are really looking at repurposing or renovating commercial space and building it out as residential space. Others are really looking at the indoor grow operation anew, not just from kind of, you know, the cannabis side that we've seen a lot of in recent years, but, you know, lettuce, tomatoes, all sorts of things, and then closer and closer in, you know, to the population centers. That's picking up a lot of steam and interest, especially in these heavily vacant spaces. And then you have, you know, crazes like pickleball being the subject of a lot of like upgrades. So those are a good area and something that that's generating a lot of activity. Those are great opportunities to look at holistic deep retrofits, since a lot of those are pretty significant upgrades. Going from commercial to residential is a significant modification for most building spaces, and certainly going from, say, a warehouse or a big office or a big retail store, big box, to pickleball would definitely require modifications as well. And think about this relationship. We don't think about how all of this is coming together, this perfect storm, those downward trends that I mentioned, supply chain restrictions and shortages that still exist, and combine that with all this additional money going towards electrification, putting in heat pumps. Who's going to install those? Who's going to install all the EV charging stations and equipment? So the lighting industry is getting very involved in that, both from a product distribution standpoint, but also the labor side of it too. So some of these same electricians and individuals are the same ones that are going to be called on, or that need to be retrained or uptrained to be able to do a lot of this additional work that we're talking about. Lighting and lighting controls allows for those deeper retrofits. That relationship between electrification that I was talking about can really help. Metals, aluminum, copper, some of the same things that are required to build lighting equipment and install lighting equipment are also going to things like, batteries and EV type equipment, and the whole electrification effort as a whole. So again, that's kind of exacerbating the problems. And again, more focus on DC grids, more focus on DC. That bodes well for LEDs and lighting and controls as a whole. That's another kind of interaction here. Controls, again, a lot of interaction. And then codes, meeting codes, trade-offs, leveraging lighting, better lighting and lighting controls to maybe allow for something else as well. So again, a lot of interactions, a lot of synergies with lighting and electrification that are important to keep in mind and be aware of. Another one that I got a lot of attention at this year's Light Fair was germicidal ultraviolet. So it's been around a while. You may have seen some residential systems with kind of installed, kind of in line with the filtration system, but something else has occurred recently, and ASHRAE just released standard 241. It's actually 241, not 241P anymore, since it was published on July 7th of this year. So this specifically complements like 62.1 and the previous kind of ventilation requirements by specifically focusing on outdoor air requirements and ventilation for the control of infectious diseases or aerosols. So it's important to note this will increase equivalent outdoor air requirements between 2 to 10x. So in spaces like hospitals and hospital rooms and schools, there's some significant increases, and this has huge potential impacts on energy. And germicidal ultraviolet appears to be by far the most cost-effective, especially this upper room device system that I'm showing you here on the right. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. This isn't going to happen overnight, but depending on how the market, how particular verticals like healthcare, like schools, look at this and potentially require it in the future, we'll have to wait and see how the different authorities having jurisdiction look at this standard and whether they require it, and how quickly either the market or regulators kind of adopt this new standard that has just become available for that. And a lot of it may depend also on just how bad the next flu season is, or other diseases or funguses in hospitals, et cetera, that we've seen a lot of lately. If that trend continues with our warming conditions like we expect them to, then this could get much more attention and much quicker adoption. It's definitely something to look at for a kind of lighting related potential savings opportunity, doing it with GUV as opposed to filtration, or bringing in more outdoor air and conditioning that. All right, so with all that in mind, I wanted to just quickly introduce like a little program that we presented in a couple of the RFP responses that we did. More specifically, we just submitted for the Buildings Upgrade Prize, and we submitted this Community Energy Concierge for Equity Eligible buildings idea, which really focuses on that equity, that Justice 40 piece, really going after underserved businesses, and the workforce development aspect that's really required, not just to do the work that we're talking about, but do the work and have that capacity available in these communities that are traditionally underserved, so they're not going off, to the metroplex or the more populated areas. We need to build that capacity locally. So this program braids funding, so braiding different funding sources from workforce development, from grants, from utility programs and incentives, from other donations, from in-kind contributions from partners, whether they're manufacturers or other partners that you bring into the program, and then pooling resources. So not just those financial resources, but again, that in-kind technical support, bringing in partners, the trade allies, the CBOs, the local community entities that are involved there, and pulling that all together to do for comprehensive impacts, not just comprehensive from kind of a measure perspective, but also, really involving all those partners and building that capacity in those local underserved communities. So this actual program model doesn't just include your typical energy efficiency, lighting and controls, and HVAC and weatherization. Buildings Upgrade Prize has a specific electrification focus. So we're leveraging those lower cost lighting control systems, weatherization measures to build savings and justify further expenditures for more expensive, like air source heat pump or heat pump water heater type equipment in these facilities. But we're also looking at, by implementing lighting and lighting control systems that enable integration and demand response. They enable for entities that are interested, you pull in additional funding specifically for EVs, specifically for electrification, and grant money maybe targeted at specific verticals like schools. And you pool this to not only do energy efficiency, but this demand response, transportation, electrification, and broader decarbonization type work. So all that data, all that infrastructure and that intel, if you build a solid platform, can be leveraged to do more data-driven type core SEM type strategic energy management type initiatives. And if you're going to do that, capture the carbon impact, again, focusing in on some of those non-energy impacts, leveraging those, selling those to promote the projects, to improve ROI. But ultimately, as we get better at combining all of these different kind of offerings and entities, combining them to improve the overall cost effectiveness within our programs. So this is kind of where we're looking and where we're heading, not just looking at lighting and lighting controls standalone, but really looking at it as that one of those first steps of enabling technology to do much, much more of this other work. So with that, I think we've got about 45 minutes left for questions. And so I wanted to go ahead and open it up and check back with Nick to see if we have any questions in the chat bar.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Let's see. So yeah, and so everyone, as you think of questions, please type them into the question box, and I will read them to Kyle, get them answered. Let's go with this first one. Can you talk more about where workforce is and what sort of development needs to occur as our programs evolve?
Sure. Let me go ahead and go back to this slide, and I'll use this as a potential example. So where is our current workforce? So if, over the past few years, say 70, 75, as much as 80+% of our savings are coming from lighting, then a lot of our trade allies are those lighting contractors, lighting maintenance companies, ESCOs, that are really, really focused on lighting. And it's a struggle or a challenge, especially for the smaller ones, to really start thinking about, how do I sell? How do I install, heat pumps and other type of equipment? How do I actually install, or how do I get comfortable specifically with controls? So we a lot of contractors still aren't comfortable with network or luminaire level lighting controls in and of itself. So a lot of the workforce development has to maybe start there, help them understand and feel comfortable with that technology and recognize that the benefits, with a good, solid incentive program, with the support in place, with training, the cost really, the benefits really do exceed the cost of adding that incremental control in there, helping them understand that, helping them get comfortable with it, helping them also understand the additional benefits or potential services or service models that can be driven by those controls. So don't look at controls as, oh my God, they're going to call me back, but how do I use that control system to provide the most flexible, the most beneficial, the most elegant, effective system that's going to maximize benefits for that particular customer, and not just now, but maybe 6 months from now, if they change their facilities or their users change a little bit, maybe they can leverage kind of a service agreement with your company to kind of go in there and modify that. Maybe they want you to pull in the occupancy data and help them integrate that with their BMS system, or at least try to figure out how they can better integrate that and learn from the data that comes from those systems. So starting there and then really working with them step by step to more integration, providing multiple different types of service, not just doing lighting, but also doing kind of that EV type support, like a lot of the distributors are doing on the supply side by providing EV equipment and other electrification type based equipment. The same thing is true on kind of the broader TA contractor ESCO side of the business as well, really building out the capacity, and not just building it out in your bigger markets, but also building it out in the smaller communities and building it at a level that we've never seen before. So with all this infrastructure bill and IRA funding coming down, we really just don't have the capacity to even do what a lot of the states are thinking of or planning on doing. So it's about sheer volume. It's about the type or content or aspects of training, the subjects, the areas, the technologies that need to be the focus, and getting what's kind of a traditional trade ally base and really growing it and incorporating and growing the skills of our existing one, but also bringing in other trade allies into the program that have a broader skill set to do some of this bigger, broader integration, deeper retrofit type work that's going to be required of programs of the future. Getting comfortable with data, comfortable with data privacy and security is a challenge, but you have to start somewhere, and we have to start now, so that 2-3 years down the road, as we start seeing those saturation levels increase and that those pressures on our baselines increase, we've got to be ready for that. We've got to be ready for all this funding coming down the pipeline as well.
All right, Kyle, let's go to that discussion slide, discussion ideas. We have a few questions coming in, but please, here's some other discussion ideas. If something has popped into your head, type it into the question box. So Kyle, you mentioned using lighting as an enabling technology. Could you explain what you mean by that in more detail?
Yeah, sure. I think I went into it a little bit. The key really boils down to, what kind of data, what kind of information is available within a lighting system. And traditionally, we always talk about occupancy, or the light levels themselves. So obviously, understanding light levels, understanding what's going on in the space will really enable us to dynamically kind of dial in what type of lighting that we want at any given moment for a particular occupant or an occupant's changing needs. So it can enable a lot of different things just by understanding what kind of light, what sort of color temperatures are available if you can dynamically change the magnitude and the character of that lighting based upon the needs of the occupants in the space, that's one way to enable. Occupancy is obviously a big point that if you can pull that data in and understand that, again, it will enable you to do better and more accurate targeting of DR, but better and more accurate targeting of, temperature setbacks and broader HVAC control and integration. So again, being able to understand that data, being able to understand how to pull it in and leverage it, but not just that data, but now also temperature data, humidity data, pressure data. I'm not a mechanical contractor, but as we start adding that type of information, maybe CO2 data and information, if that system lives, if that data lives within the lighting system and we can pull that in to a central location and make that available to integrators, to the mechanical folks, as we're working on these projects and increasing that integration and partnership, and cross-training with our trade ally networks, we can enable a lot deeper savings going forward. Thinking about the GUV or that germicidal ultraviolet, understanding if people are in the space allows you to dose maybe at higher levels, while the spaces are unoccupied. There's upper room GUV, but there's also direct GUV, and you don't want to be administering a lot of or higher volumes of direct GUV while occupants are in the space. So you need to be able to have that information to, again, minimize the impacts of those increased outdoor air requirements, for example. But those are just different ways where you have to start thinking about that lighting control system as really the place to land all that data and information. And we need to get better at leveraging it and using it to enable deeper measures, deeper integration.
All right. So you mentioned germicidal ultraviolet. Can that help override outside air requirements?
Yes. And that's the general idea. Again, the amount of, if you think about going back to like COVID in the early days, a lot of, I know, for example, even my local school district really ramped up their ventilation, but they also ramped up just basic cleaning. So they broke out, the sponges and the rags and all the disinfectant equipment and stuff like that, over and over. So the idea behind leveraging that upper room or direct GUV is to leverage something that's much more cost effective. So I wish I had some charts to show you on that, but the cost, to meet some of those new requirements, like specifically in, say, a hospital room or a waiting room in a doctor's office or a hospital room, are literally kind of off the chart. Whereas germicidal ultraviolet could be 50 to 100 times more cost effective than, for example, increasing the MERV rating for filtration, because again, that increases resistance in your system, and there's energy penalty, for that increased resistance in your system. And similarly, bringing in all that outdoor air to try and accomplish this. Again, during COVID, it was shown that both those methods weren't as effective at reducing COVID. It wasn't, infection was occurring at the point of contact, at the point of emission. So controlling it at the filter or controlling it by bringing outdoor air, you have to actually get inside the space at the point at which, someone coughs or someone touches the space. You really need to disinfect in those spaces. That's not only the most cost effective way of eliminating those viruses, but it's definitely the most cost effective way that we've seen. So there's a lot of research within the DOE going on with that right now. If you just type in germicidal GUV type C Type C is a lower wavelength that's less harmful to humans. There's also, type B, type A. If you read your sunscreen bottles, you'll see that like the type A and type B are the stuff that kind of burns you or can harm you in the outdoors a lot. But this is GUVC, so they specifically design it for that, and in doses. And then they also try to use upper room and non-indirect type approaches to minimize the impacts or risks for the occupants.
All right, Kyle, we just have a couple more minutes left. So quickly, what would you suggest teams look at within an existing portfolio of programs?
Yeah, so again, I didn't touch on that as much, but certainly I'm alluded to the effectiveness of, say, like a midstream approach for targeting remaining potential out there, especially when you're going after those smaller or micro businesses, really targeting that at the point of sale through the distributor or maybe those big box retailers, commercial sales counters, etc., is an effective way of kind of going after that. We also talked a lot about controls and being very thoughtful or systematic about how you design your incentives and your approaches. So when you look at your incentive structure for prescriptive, really kind of put the foot on the scale, for those controls. If you really want to get that additional incremental savings and get that enabling technology, we talk about it all the time. There really is a penalty to just replacing 1 for 1, tube for tube, because most TLEDs aren't inherently controllable. While they may be controllable and DLC requires them to be controllable, it's hard to go back in and put a specific control system in place for TLED technology. So it's better to look at fixtures, focus your efforts and your incentives maybe more on fixtures, because it's easier to incorporate controls technologies, and it's a better overall solution and higher quality lighting, better savings on both the fixture side, etc. So really focus on getting that enabling technology in, and then really starting to roll in some of these integration tiers or bonuses or design bonuses, and starting to look very closely at how your lighting trade allies and lighting controls trade allies are interacting with your mechanical folks on the HVAC side, and working on program designs that build on this comprehensive integration type approach, because that's where we need to be looking. And use IRA, use the infrastructure bill, use this funding, look for opportunities to work for partners who are accessing this funding and put that to work for you now. Do the R&D, do the pilot work to build that next generation of programs now. That's really what IRA and the infrastructure bill funding creates for us right now. It's an opportunity to not only weather those downward pressures on the supply chain and the economy as a whole, and the R word, recession, but we can leverage that in our programs to kind of weather through this, muscle through it, and also build that next generation of programs, so that when we come out the other end of this in 2, 3, 4 years, by leveraging that funding, we're able to build and have cost-effective options available that do this sort of comprehensive work, not just for the big customers, but also for these smaller, underserved customers that really need the work.
Excellent. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much, Kyle, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found today's presentation valuable about the future of commercial lighting opportunities, and please stay tuned for future Learning Series webinars. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.